And I just want to give a quick update, a quick recap of where we've been before we delve into where we're going. So for those of you who were not here last week, very briefly, I will just say that Arvei Pesachim, which is the 10th parak of Mishnah Pesachim, is perhaps one of the most famous chapters in the entire Mishnah. And it is outlining what we have now as the Seder, but we should recognize and we should remember that what we have here in the Mishnah is a really important source text for how the Haggadah ultimately evolves and changes. And one really wonderful source to go to if you're interested in how the Haggadah evolves and changes, especially around sources and putting things together, is Rav Eli Kanfor from Hadar, has a Haggadah Insights project. So that is a really good source if you're interested in thinking about how does the Mishnah evolve later on into the Haggadah. And the Haggadah is a continuously evolving document as well. We are looking just at the Mishnah because the Mishnah is really a foundation for how the Seder took its shape. And there are going to be things that will arise in this text that may be very confusing to us, or we might have questions like, why is it done this way in this text? And what is the rabbi's ultimate goal here? And as I said last week, there is a scholarly debate about what the actual goal or intent of this chapter of Mishnah is. Because in the remaining chapters of Mishnah Pesachim, you have everything around preparing for Pesach, including searching for chametz, including destroying chametz, including all of the things that we do to prepare. And now we're getting to this chapter where we're actually talking about Leil Pesach, the night of the Seder. So some folks believe that this was intended as a way of remembering what had been so that it could be immediately constituted again when the temple was rebuilt. In other words, it isn't that the temple was destroyed a long time ago and therefore we have this meal that reenacts this Korban Pesach that we used to offer when the temple stood, and we now have this meal that takes its place. But we have these things we do that are Zecher LaMikdash, the remembrance of the temple, and Zecher LaKorban, the remembrance of that Korban. That instead, this is intended as a ritual remembrance so that when Bimhei Rabbi Amenu, in the rabbi's imagination, the temple is rebuilt, we can immediately start doing this all over again. And there are those, and this would also be supported by the fact that in later centuries, the idea of Eliyahu HaNavi coming to the Seder, Elijah the prophet, because the Seder is the night of redemption and the Seder is the night of the coming of the Mashiach. But in our case, it also could be understood as something that is really just a reenactment. We're going to assume in this context that it could be that this chapter is actually very much anticipating the renewal of the actual ritual. But in the meantime, we have this meal that is built on very fancy meals called the Roman Symposia that were done in the society the rabbis were living in. And also, we are definitely thinking and focusing on the idea that we have the mitzvah to tell the story. And that's where we're going today. In our first text, we will be encountering a very, very famous part of the Magid, of the telling of the story. Magid actually is from the Hebrew binyan hif'il, which is the causative binyan, and this is in the present tense, meaning that we will cause to tell, or he will cause to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And with that as a little bit of a recap, I would like to now turn directly to the text. We will be reading in the English only for ease of access. However, if you are someone who is able to read the Hebrew, I definitely encourage you to please use that, read that. This first text we're going to be going through is an incredibly important one. If we are able to go on to the text after that, great, but we may be spending a lot of time here. So in the English, we will begin with the attendants poured the second cup. Now, last week, I'm just going to note before we go into this text, we had lots of questions about what does it mean to have a holiday that's commemorating our redemption from Egypt. And then there are these attendants. How do we square that contradiction? And I think it is an incredibly important question that we have to be always asking ourselves. And what I encourage us to remember always is that human beings aspire to act in ways that are aligned with our highest values and aspirations. And I think it is fair to say and uncontroversial to say that our species does a very poor job of always behaving according to what our highest ideals and aspirations are. So the idea that you would have someone in the role of a servant in your household, dafka on Leil Pesach, feels extraordinarily difficult, if not downright embarrassing to folks now, thinking about the contradiction between having a holiday all about freedom and then having someone else pour your cup. We actually have the practice now in a lot of places, because we are all meant to be b'nei chorin, of course, free people on Pesach, that we each pour for the next person, because we don't do it for ourselves, but we do it for each other as a sign of kindness. So in the cultural context out of which the Mishnah is arising, this is certainly a challenge. And I often think of this as akin to indentured servitude, which is obviously not a practice that we in any way want to be emulating. There are, and I'm going to try to find those articles, there are articles that go into this issue in greater depth. I'm just saying this up front because I really want to focus on the text today, but it is a very important area, and I just want to name that it will keep coming up. And I want us to hold that with the realism that as human beings, we so often do not live up to the highest ideals, even as most of us, I would hope, strive every day to do so. So with that bit of an introduction and disclaimer, I now want to turn to the text. And I remind folks that we are reading the Steinsaltz edition from Sefaria. Therefore, there is commentary in the text. And I encourage us to just read the text as it is, including the commentary. It's just easier that way. So would anybody like to begin in the English? We will be beginning with the words, the attendants poured the second cup.
And just a reminder to use the raise hand function so that I can call on you. Okay, I see Rabbi Joan Sachs would like to read. I am asking you to unmute.
Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Really appreciate it.
The attendants poured the second cup for the leader of the Seder. And here the son asks his father the questions about the differences between Passover night and a regular night. And if the son does not have the intelligence to ask questions on his own, his father teaches him the questions. The Mishnah lists the questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? As on all other nights, we eat leavened bread and matzah as preferred. On this night, all our bread is matzah. As on all other nights, we eat other vegetables. On this night, we eat bitter herbs. The Mishnah continues its list of the questions. When the temple was standing, one would ask, as on all other nights, we eat either roasted, stewed, or cooked meat. But on this night, all the meat is the roasted meat of the Paschal lamb. The final question was asked even after the destruction of the temple. As on all other nights, we dip the vegetables in a liquid during the meal only once. However, on this night, we dip twice. And according to the intelligence and the ability of the son, his father teaches him about the Exodus. When teaching his son about the Exodus, he begins with the Jewish people's disgrace and concludes with their glory. And he expounds from the passage, "An Aramean tried to destroy my father," Deuteronomy 26:5. The declaration one recites when presenting his first fruits at the temple until he concludes explaining the entire section.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sachs, for that beautiful reading. I really appreciate it. All right, so we have here a very, very familiar bit of text, I imagine, to many of us. And if you're anything like me, you might have the melody in your head right now. So if you're having that moment of 2 weeks from tonight, thinking about 2 weeks from tonight, we're going to be singing that melody, just hold that in your mind as we explore this text together. So you'll notice a couple of things here that I think are really important to mention. We think of this as the 4 questions, and there's been a lot of curiosity around which questions do we ask and why. And it's immediately apparent here that some of these are very familiar to us and some of these not so familiar to us. We're very familiar, of course, with why is this night different from all other nights? We're familiar, of course, with, why on this night do we dip only once? Why on this night do we dip twice when on all other nights we dip once? I think that it's really interesting. I often think about these questions because I know for me, at least, on my Shabbat practice, so often there are many, many salatim involved and lots of dipping. So thinking about how different people had different kinds of meals, I think is just really interesting historical fact to think about these questions. But the thing I want to focus on again is, why do we have this question here about the kind of meat that we eat? And of course, we don't ask this anymore. But what's really interesting, and what I learned recently, is that this question about roasted or stewed or cooked meat, this actually appears in Haggads Out that align with what's known as the Eretz Yisraeli tradition, and that existed up to a millennium after the destruction. So those of us who have never encountered that tradition before, and I imagine many of us in this room probably are familiar with the traditional 4 questions about why isn't they different from all other nights, and why do we eat bitter, what is the bitter herbs, and do we dip once or, why do we dip twice on this night, and why do we recline? Right? There's no question here about reclining. And instead of that question about reclining, we have instead this question about the meat. Why are we eating this meat in this different kind of a way? So I think it's really interesting to just reflect for a moment on exactly why we ask what we ask, because the Seder is supposed to be, as the rabbis understood it, it's supposed to be a time of questions and answers. And a lot of times there's this notion in rabbinic literature around the Seder that, as we see in this Mishnah, that the son, and we're gonna talk a lot about this ability and intelligence thing in a second. So just hold your thoughts on that. I'm going to speak a little bit about this, and then we're going to open it up to some questions before we move on to the next Mishnah. The rabbis are very interested in conveying this story Lador Vador, right? We think about Lador Vador all the time as this critical Jewish value. We think about it particularly on Pesach with the telling of the story of our exodus from Egypt, and that has to be done in a way that engages the youngest person at the Seder, which was assumed to be a child. Now, some of us may be at Seders this year without any kids. Some of us may be at very kid-focused Seders. Some of us may be having Seder alone. But even still, as the tradition evolved, it was understood by the rabbis that it doesn't matter who is at the table, we are still asking these questions. Because, as I'm going to borrow a concept from mindfulness practice, the rabbis, I think, are really interested in their own way, and they wouldn't use these words, but very interested in their own way about thinking about the Seder as an activity that we engage in with beginner's mind. So when we think about this from a perspective of beginner's mind, we all know the story. I'm sure if we were to go around this room, which we're not going to do right now, but I'm sure if we were to go around and everybody were to, we were to collate Magid together, right? Like, let's say we all started from the 4 questions and through the end of Magid, And we all started to outline exactly what the story was and exactly what happened and how it happened. I am confident that we could all collaboratively piece together the entire story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. We hear it every year at Pesach. It shows up in the Torah reading. It shows up in Kiddush. It is one of those foundational aspects of how Jewish self-understanding has manifested over millennia. But yet, the rabbis, I think, are asking us with these questions to approach this night with a beginner's mind, to approach this night Ke'ilu as though we had never experienced this before, because the ritual act that we're going through is the reminder and the remembrance and the reenactment all together of this momentous night in the Jewish collective memory and self-understanding. So I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of why are these questions here? And I also just want to name that, of course, they shifted because there was no question about reclining, because the assumption was, well, everybody reclined right at a fancy meal. Like, we didn't need to ask about that. Whereas now we don't have that custom. So those on Seder night who do have the custom of reclining and leaning to the left, that question makes sense to say, well, why do we ask about this reclining? And it's interesting that we don't anymore have any question about meat, even though for those of you who are meat eaters, I myself am not, but for those of you who are, you might have brisket. And that is a very long-standing tradition to have brisket on Seder night. It's a long-standing custom. And according to Rav Kanfer, it actually could go back to a connection to this question about roasted or cooked or stewed meat. So that's what I want to note about the 4 questions part of the Mishnah. The second piece, there are 2 other pieces I want to address, and then we're going to open it up. The second piece is the issue of, and I'm going to use the word da'at to describe this, the question of ability and intelligence. And I think it's very important to think about this head on, and I think it's very important to think about this intellectually honestly. So we are working with a text that is part of a larger tradition that takes for granted the importance of what is known as da'at, or awareness. Now, it's interesting because those of you who have learned any bit of Chassidut may be aware that da'at is a term that Hasidic texts use a lot to talk about awareness and mindfulness. They don't use the term mindfulness, but da'at is a term that is used a lot to think about awareness. Da'at is also very often and very importantly used in the weekday Amidah, which it's for its first petitionary blessing. So in the first of what are known as the middle blessings of the weekday Amidah, we have a bracha that begins with Atah honeh la'adam da'at milamed la'enosh binah. Sorry about that. And what does that mean? It means that Hashem has given or has bestowed upon human beings da'at, and we have the ability to distinguish things with that da'at. It also shows up in the edition for Havdalah. It's a very important idea, but fundamentally, it is about understanding. It is about understanding or comprehension. Those are the words that I'm going to use, less so intelligence, more understanding and comprehension. So when we're thinking about who is asking the 4 questions, the rabbis really care about this thing called da'at, because that ultimately determines your religious obligation. Now, for many of us, thinking about this today, particularly if you're thinking about it from an inclusion perspective, you might look at this and be like, well, that seems really problematic to me. That the only people you would ask to ask the 4 questions are those who have the ability and intelligence to do so. And I want to address that in 2 different ways. One practically and one more aligned with the ways the rabbinic tradition understood this idea. So on a practical level, I think it actually is really important to remember that even though we have this tradition of the youngest person at Seder asking the 4 questions, that is a tradition that we have today, then I think it is really important to remember that for some people, it's an incredibly scary thing to do, and to just honor that maybe that person actually doesn't really want to do that thing. And maybe they really would prefer to have a different role. So part of this is saying, let's loosen our ideas about what our customs need to be. And if the youngest person really just doesn't want to ask the 4 questions aloud by themselves, it doesn't have to be that way. Everybody could do it together. Somebody else could ask the 4 questions. Like, there's so many different ways to approach that. But then to return to the question of the text and this notion of da'at in the rabbinic imagination, this was really important for the rabbis because it determined a person, and let's say a man, because we're talking about men here in the context of religious obligation. And when we talk about religious obligation, what we mean is the obligation to perform ritual actions at particular times. Now, women in much more traditional communities still have an obligation to be the Seder. And those of us who are completely egalitarian in how we understand ritual practice and ritual obligation, this is understood to be applicable to everybody. So, but in the context of its own context, the Mishnah here is talking about the importance of a person having the ability to comprehend the task they are being given, and how the rabbis understood who was or who could comprehend the task being given is a complicated one. And I think that for me, the way that I approach these things is to think about them in their context, and then to invite myself and to invite all of us to actually look inward and ask ourselves the question, am I conducting my Seder, or am I thinking about this in the most inclusive way? What do I think about intelligence? It's very, very easy for us to think about this text and say, that seems really problematic. Thank goodness we don't behave that way anymore. Let's move forward. It's much harder for us to say, oh, that's really problematic. How am I still carrying forward those behaviors? And how can I transform myself? And that's how I always choose to look at these hard texts. And there are often very hard texts that we can't recontextualize. And then in that case, I believe that it's very important to learn them because they're part of what makes for our very human tradition. And then it's very important for us to make the active choice to say, okay, and this is not aligned with my values, and I'm going to put forward a Judaism that is. And I think that all the more so today, that is a role that we have to, without apology, embrace. It's very, very important that we know our values, that we know that they are authentically rooted in the Jewish tradition, and that we put forward a Judaism that is emblematic of inclusion and love and peace and all of those wonderful things. So with that note on the note about that, I'm just going to end by saying the rabbis finish this text by outlining how Magid begins and ends. And for folks who are less familiar with the traditional texts, the Magid is predominantly made up of midrashim, that some of which are extraordinarily self-explanatory, and much of which, as if you're thinking, I'm thinking right now, for example, about the plagues. When you get to the 10 plagues in some Haggadot, there's like this really long explanation about there was 50 and 250, and it goes on and on and on. And at some Seders I've been to, we jokingly refer to it as the rabbinic math problem. The rabbis are very midrashic in their understanding, and they put forward the Magid, the telling, in this very rabbinic way that many folks are very alienated from today because it's not immediately apparent as to how is this text actually telling the story. So the rabbis are closing this Mishnah by very briefly outlining that we begin with my father was a wandering Aramean. This is usually said on Shavuot when we bring the first fruits to the temple, because Shavuot was known as the time of the bringing of the first fruits of the harvest. And then we end with, quote, the entire section, meaning it goes until we get to our next text. So before we go on to the next text, which is going to outline the really important things and one of my favorite lines in this entire Mishnah, which we'll get to in a few minutes, I want to open it up to any questions that folks might have or reflections or reactions. I invite you to please put those into the chat. And because I do want to make sure we cover this next text and give it the time that it's due, I'm going to invite us to pause for 3 or 4 minutes now, and then we are going to pick back up. So don't worry if I don't get to your question. We will hold things to the end.
So sorry. So I'm reading you questions now?
If there are any comments in the chat, or if anybody has their hand raised, yeah, no problem at all.
Gotcha. Just double checking. Okay. Yeah. So our first question is, in the Mishnah, it says that an Aramean tried to destroy my father. It differs from the Sepharia translation of Deuteronomy. My father was a fugitive Aramean. I don't understand this text and also wonder about the differing translations.
Is the question specifically, I'm going to assume here, and please, questioner, if I'm incorrect, please feel free to correct in the chat. But my understanding of that you're asking is, I don't understand this text. Why are the translations different? In terms of what is going on in this actual text from Deuteronomy, this is, again, referring to the first fruits declaration. It's being transposed here from its original context, which was presenting first fruits at the temple. This was a text that would be sent by every single person bringing their first fruits to the Kohen. It was kind of it was our national, sort of like our origin story. My father, Jacob, was a wanderer, went down to Egypt with 70 people, right? We see this in the Haggadah, went down to Egypt with 70 people. Why did Jacob go down to Egypt? Because there was the famine, and that's how we landed there. We were then enslaved and oppressed. We then left and out, right? That was the way that we began this declaration of who we are as we are presenting this sacrifice to God via our first fruits. And what's also really interesting is that, and I have a lot of questions as to why this is here, but it's also very interesting to just note that this is a text that would have been said by every single person. So the Kohen, the poor Kohen, is hearing this over and over and over again as all these first fruits are being brought. Now, why do the translations differ? Translation is inherently commentary. So even with the most accurate and succinct and what some of us call inside or the most precise translation you could imagine, every single translator is going to use words that they think will best convey the meaning of the text. So there also, again, is the Aramean sought to destroy my father, and that has to do, of course, with Lavan and how Lavan was very, at the end of Jacob's time with Lavan, there was certainly the incident where Lavan was pursuing Jacob because, first of all, he thought that he had stolen all of his livestock. He had stolen all of his kids, all of his grandsons and one granddaughter, or maybe more. The Midrash says there could be more. And also potentially his idols. So that is also a piece of this as well, that there are different ways to understand this notion of the Aramean. I think the best way to understand it in this context is that my father was a wandering Aramean, that it's actually referring to Jacob coming down, and less so in our Mishnaic context, less so the context of Lavan, although, of course, Lavan, that context from Genesis is very important. So for the sake of time, I am actually going to invite us to move ahead with the text. So what I would love to do now is invite someone to read our next Mishnah. This is a very central part of the Seder. And we're going to start in the English again. And this, apologies, this is another very long text. We're going to start in the English with Rabban Gamliel would say. If anyone is prepared to read the English for us, that would be great.
You can use the raise hand function. Oh, great. Natasha, I've asked you to unmute. Natasha, did you raise your hand? Okay.
Okay, no problem. Do we have anyone else?
It looks like Deborah has also raised her hand, so I'm going to call on Deborah. I think Natasha got kicked out of the room.
Oh no. Okay, hopefully we'll get her back.
I hope so. So here's the text. Rabban Gamliel would say, anyone who did not say these three matters on Passover has not fulfilled his obligation: the paschal lamb, the matzah, and bitter herbs. When one mentions these matters, he must elaborate and explain them. The paschal lamb is brought because the omnipresent passed over, Pesach, the houses of our forefathers in Egypt, as it is stated, that you shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's paschal offering, for he passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. Exodus 12:27. Rabban Gamliel continues to explain, the reason for matzah is because our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt, as it is stated, and they baked the dough that they took out of Egypt as cakes of matzot, for it was not leavened, as they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victual. Exodus 12:39. The reason for bitter herbs is because the Egyptians embittered our forefathers' lives in Egypt, as it is stated, and they embittered their lives with hard service, in mortar and in brick, in all manner of service in the field. All the service that they made them serve was with rigor. Exodus 1:14. The Tana of the Mishnah further states, in each and every generation, a person must view himself as though he personally left Egypt, as it is stated, and you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of this which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. Exodus 13:8. In every generation, each person must say, this which the Lord did for me, and not this which the Lord did for my forefathers. The Mishnah continues with the text of the Haggadah. Therefore, we are obligated to thank, praise, glorify, extol, exalt, honor, bless, revere, and laud, Tekalis, the one who performed for our forefathers and for us all these miracles. He took us out from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy, from mourning to a festival, from darkness to a great light, and from enslavement to redemption. And we will say before him, Hallelujah. At this point, one recites the Hallel that is said on all joyous days. Since one does not complete Hallel at this point in the Seder, the Mishnah asks.
Wonderful. Deborah, that was beautiful reading. Thank you. And thank you also for reading all of the Steinsaltz commentary. As you no doubt noticed as we're going through, Steinsaltz is adding a lot of explanatory commentary and explaining, how things have appeared in our Haggadot. So that's very helpful context. And thank you for, reading it as he puts it with the rest of the actual Mishnah text. That was a really beautiful reading. So a couple of things here. So this may be another really familiar piece for some folks, maybe less so for others. So I'm going to just talk about a little bit again of what's going on here. One of the most important parts of the Seder traditionally understood is the part of the Haggads Out that's after the main part of Magid that talks about the three things that Rabban Gamliel says that we must remember to point out on Seder night. If we don't point those things out, we have not fulfilled our obligation. And as we just described, they are the Paschal offering, the Pesach offering, the matzah, and the maror. And this is, again, before we do the blessings over the matzah and the blessings over the maror, which those are blessings that we make specifically on Pesach because the rabbis understand that we have a specific mitzvah to eat both matzah and maror. And we also, of course, do our Hillel sandwich a little bit later on as a zecher l'mikdash. And because Hillel, Hillel had the custom of wrapping his sacrificial meat with the bitter herbs and the matzah. So we do all of that together, lezech, and in remembrance of what he did. So that is, again, a remembrance of Rabbi Gamliel. And these are the things that the rabbis feel are essential for us to remember. That everything really, yes, Magid is important and all those midrashim and the 4 questions, all those things are super important. But for one who have technically, and again, we're talking about rabbinic understandings of obligation, for one who have technically fulfilled their obligation to do a Seder on, on Pesach, it is most important to mention these 3 things: the Pesach offering, the matzah, and the maror. So in our day, we obviously don't have an offering. That's why a lot of people have a shankbone, or some of us vegetarians use a beet for that, to represent that sacrificial offering. And then, of course, we have our matzah and our bitter herbs, whatever we use, whether it's horseradish or bitter lettuce or whatever we're using for our maror. And those are things that we mention. And also, then we talk about here, we're getting into a little bit of the Hallel. And everything here is being likened back or hearkening us back to the car, which is the line, which is one of my favorite lines in this text. B'chol dor v'dor hayav hadam. In every generation, every person is obligated to see themselves as if they went out of Egypt. It's not something to go back to our question of, is this just a remembrance, or is this something that we are really reenacting in a ritual way? It's not just that we are, in fact, thinking about, thousands of years ago, we went through the story of deliverance from Egypt, but actually the rabbis here understand that we, in every generation, are obligated to see ourselves as if we went out of Egypt ourselves. That it wasn't just something that our ancestors did, but it's something that we also have done in our own way. And that's why I think that the story of the Exodus is so fundamental to Jewish self-understanding. And I think that really drives many of us to the work and the way that we do things we do in the world. And I think that it is really, really important in this Pesach season to live that out as best as we can, to think about, what does it mean to be free? What does it actually mean to want that not only for our own people and our own selves, but to want to live in a world that is free? And when the rabbis ask us in every generation that we are obligated, chayav, we have an obligation to see ourselves as if ki'iluhu yatsa mimitzrayim, as if we went out of Egypt ourselves, not just our ancestors. This is not something removed. It's something active. It's not meant to be passive. We're just sitting around reading a book, Haggads Out, and then finally we eat something. The rabbis really wanted this to be an active, participatory retelling that actually shows up, this is what I believe, and how we're supposed to live our lives. That Pesach, in so many ways, is probably the most foundational holiday we have. We are, some of us may already be in Rosh Chodesh, depending on our time zone. But for those of us who are not yet, we are, as we are together right now in this moment, we are about to enter Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Rosh Chodesh Nisan is a new year. So at the end of our session today, I will be wishing everybody a Shana Tova U'Metuka, because Rosh Chodesh Nisan is a new year. It is the biblical new year for the festivals, because Pesach, as the rabbis understand it, is the foundational festival. All of the other festivals are crucial, right? Our year would not be complete without them. But this is our founding narrative. And so when the rabbis say here, we are obligated to see ourselves as if we went out of Egypt, that is meant to be an active thing. That is meant to fundamentally show us how we are to be spiritually and how we are to be as human beings in the world. That's one of our tradition's greatest bits of wisdom. And we, I think, need this today more than ever. So I encourage us, as we all enter Nisan, to really take that to heart. And that gets us into the praise, into the Hallel. So Rav Confer argues that originally the Seder was about two things, as showed in this Mishnah. One, the remembrance of the three things, the Pesach offering, the matzah and the maror, and secondarily, Hallel. That in fact, Hallel at the Seder night is the only time, traditionally, I think there are some people who might do this on Erev Rosh Hashanah as well, but I believe that most communities saying Hallel at night on Erev Pesach is the only time that Hallel is ever said at night. Hallel is usually done in the morning. Hallel, to just explain what Hallel is, Hallel are the 6 Psalms, Psalms 113 through 118, that comprise what we know of as Hallel. Those of you who may find yourself in any kind of minyan tomorrow, you will hear what is known as half Hallel, because on Rosh Chodesh, we say an abbreviated, it's not really half, I call it more like a 3/4 Hallel, but we call it half Hallel, an abbreviated version of this. But it's said on all major festivals. It is not said on the holidays, but it is said on the pilgrimage festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and it is also said on Chanukah. It is not said on Purim because the Megillah is in its place. So Hallel is this series of psalms that is a praiseworthy series of psalms, and ultimately, what may have been going on here is that the rabbis are saying, okay, so you do all these things, you say the Magid, and then you get to this point with Rabban Gamliel, and this is the most important part, but the most important thing after you do these critical things is to remember that Hallel, the outpouring of praise, is fundamentally what this meal is actually all about, which is really interesting because, as we know, as many of us may know, or many of us may have experienced, we don't always pay a ton of attention to Hallel. Many of our Seders, we do the first 2 Psalms of Hallel and we eat our meal. We make our brachot and we eat our meal. And then we're like, great, we're done. We're tired. We're going to go home and go to bed. We've had a lot to drink tonight. Like, we're done. And some of us may very quickly go through the second half of Hallel. Some of us may not do that at all. In my Seder this year, I'm going to be hosting a Seder. We're going to be spending a lot of time on the second half of Hallel because the Mishnah really understands that is the core part of the meal in addition to the Magid. That part of what we're trying to do is engage in that praise of this moment of deliverance. So it's just really interesting. It's always very interesting to think about what the actual text says here and then what actually happens sociologically in our communities, which is often very different. And I will absolutely say that I am among those who say, there are some years where I'm just like, it's, nearing midnight and then we have to do the second half of Hallel. That takes forever. And it's like, we just want to go to bed, but it's really important to remember like that the Hallel is a really core part of what we're doing. So I encourage, if it's not your family's custom to say any of Hallel or only to say part of it, maybe this is a year to try to add a little bit more in, even if it's just a few more lines of Hallel. Not only does it add a little more music to the Seder, it also can help introduce folks who may not be as familiar with the text and to Hallel. So there's always room for innovation and expansion and change. So that is just my gentle suggestion for folks for whom that has not always been a practice, to really use this as an opportunity to bring in a little bit more. So I want to now invite any questions. So if we have any in the chat here, if you don't mind reading a few of those aloud, I'll take multiple comments at once. And if not, I don't know if we're going to get to our third text. We'll try today. But also if folks want to raise their hand if they have anything to add in that way.
I do see a hand raised. Do you want me to read some of the comments and questions that have been happening in between?
Yeah. If you're raising your hand, please just have a little bit of patience and we'll get to you momentarily.
All right. I do want to get to a question that I just got that seems a little pressing, which is, I'm in shlosim for my wife. What are special ways to honor her during the Seder? She used to lead it and a marvelous discussion. Thank you.
First of all, I want to just say I am extraordinarily sorry for your loss, and we're sending so many brachot and so much chizuk to you, a lot of blessing and strength. It is extraordinarily difficult, of course, as we know, with these holidays when we don't have those that we love with us. So I'm just holding you very tenderly in this moment, and thank you for sharing that with all of us. And I imagine that we're all really holding you very tenderly in this moment. And I think it is really important to honor those we've lost at the Seder, especially as you were describing your wife leading such beautiful discussions. And in this moment, I really want to give your question the thought that it deserves. So in this moment, I will say that two things come immediately to mind. Really maybe focusing on a piece of the Seder that was her particular favorite. Is there something that she really treasured and loved to talk about? Maybe even saying, at this moment of holiday gathering, of course, we are mourning this person and we miss her dearly. And here are ways that we are honoring her memory and really lifting her name up in that moment, I think is really important. And then I also, secondarily, just for anybody who may be in the situation or maybe knows folks who are, thank goodness there is more attention being paid now in our communities to these issues and to the ways in which grief and mourning shows up at holidays, and particularly in the Seder. And I would encourage you, often local Jewish boards of family and children's services will have groups arranged for folks to think about, what do you do when you don't have your loved one at the Seder? How can you best honor them? How do you celebrate a holiday without somebody so precious? And then secondarily, there's an organization called the Blue Dove Foundation, which does specific work around mental health in the Jewish community. And I would absolutely encourage anyone and everyone to look at their resources. They have resources for every holiday, including for Pesach. So I think it's really critical. And I think it's really, really, really important that you honor where you are spiritually and emotionally in this moment. That even though this is a time of tremendous collective joy, I know in my own experience, I experienced this particularly on Purim and particularly this year, that sometimes we have holidays that ask us to be in a particular emotional space, and we're not in that emotional space for whatever reason. And I don't think it's a good idea to force ourselves to feel something we are not feeling. Even though our calendar is incredibly wise around thinking about communal experience, I think that we have an understanding today that the individual experience sometimes can't or doesn't match the communal, and that it's better for us not to do that if it doesn't feel authentic. And indeed, I think that sometimes if we try to be in a place of joy when really we're in shloshim, which is this incredibly intense period in the 30 days after somebody has died, that we really need to honor ourselves, and we need to honor where we are, and that our observance of the holiday needs to meet us where we are. So I encourage all of us to honor where we are and what our capacities are, because then if we don't, we create a situation where we feel like we're never measuring up. And I don't think that it is at all what is desired here. That often happens in our communities. I feel it all the time myself, but I want to encourage us to let that go so that we can actually show up to our holidays in a way that's actually where we actually are internally. I hope that's helpful.
We have, hold on, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make sure that I have, I'm getting to everyone's questions. Is there a place that the rabbinic commentaries make a direct connection between the holiday of Pesach and our all being at Sinai?
That is not, as far as I am aware, directly made here in at least not in this text. And I don't think that the rabbinic tradition particularly makes a connection between Pesach and us all being at Sinai. Of course, the Exodus from Egypt led us to Sinai, right? We see that in the Dayenu, which is part of the Seder and part of the Maggid in particular. But the idea that we all were at Sinai, which is a very famous idea from the Midrash, I believe it's Midrash Rabbah, Midrash Bamidbar Rabbah, excuse me. That idea is much more connected to Shavuot, because Shavuot is the holiday where we are receiving the Torah. Pesach is the holiday where we are leaving Mitzrayim and we are engaging in refraining from leavened products because we did not have the time to actually make our bread because we had to run the chipazon. We had to leave very quickly. But we don't get to the notion of where we all were at Sinai. That's much more of a Shavuot connection. The Omer, which we begin on the second night of Pesach. So those of us who do 2 Seders will do that at our second Seder, and those who only do 1 Seder will do that on the second night of Pesach when they daven Mariv or whenever they do it. We begin the counting of the Omer at that time. That is then leading us to Sinai, but there isn't a direct connection between Pesach and us all being at Sinai. That gets more into Shavuot.
All right. How much of Rabbi Gamliel's Seder protocol was a counter-narrative to the Christian appropriation of Jesus's Last Supper as the Eucharist?
That is such a phenomenal question, and I need to be honest and say I don't know, but it would not surprise me at all if there was not some anti-Christian polemic here. For sure, in terms of thinking about the Christian Eucharist, there are ways in which people understand that moment was a Seder. I think that historically speaking, that is not true for a variety of reasons, including that the Seder as we have it now did not exist when Jesus of Nazareth was alive. But the way in which that experience was understood by Christians, it wouldn't surprise me if there is a bit of a counter-narrative here, although I don't know to the extent to which that is true, although I would imagine it would not surprise me at all if Rabban Gamliel, if what he says here is a direct counter-narrative. There are, and I am not an expert here, so I'm saying this very carefully, like there is quite, every year on this time of year, there's often a very tremendous debate around the issue of Christian Seders. I'm going to hold my thoughts on that. I have an opinion on that. I'm going to hold that. I don't think that's so appropriate or relevant for this moment, but I will say that there is a way in which some of those Christian Seders have completely appropriated the notion of the matzah as representative of Jesus's body through their understanding of the Eucharist bread, which obviously is completely and utterly at odds with any way, shape, or form in which the Jewish community understands what matzah is. Matzah is, put very simply, lechem oni, the bread of affliction. Matzah is a sign of our redemption from Egypt. Matzah is a sign of our cakes not having a chance to rise because we had to leave the chipazon with great haste. So I encourage us to perhaps think about how this could be a counter-narrative, but I don't know to the extent historically how much contact Rabban Gamliel would have had with Christians, how much influence they had. I'm not quite sure, but I think it's a really important question.
I see that Maureen has had her hand raised very patiently, so I'm going to...
Maureen, thank you for your patience. Yes, let's take your question.
I'm going to ask her to unmute now.
You'll have the last question as we're almost out of time, which is crazy.
Maureen, are you with us?
I am, but I didn't have a question. I must have pushed it by mistake. Sorry.
No problem at all. Do we have any other questions in the chat?
I don't actually see any more questions in the chat. I do see people recommending different organizations and saying that you are wise and helpful.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, there are really a lot of amazing resources out there. And I think I'll say by way of wrap up, we're not going to get, hopefully next week we will complete this chapter. We'll have 4 more Mishnayot to go next week. I'm excited to do that. We may kind of skip around a little. We'll see where we go next week in our final session. But the rabbis are really, really interested, and we'll get into this particularly next week, in thinking about like why are we doing what we're doing, and are there different ways of doing what we're doing? Because this wasn't something that was out there or far away. This was really a critical component of self-understanding, and especially at a time when we had lost our temple, which was a calamitous event. It was a calamity for the Jewish people, and trying to figure out, how do we move forward? We also have all these other forces historically and internally going on as well that are shaping Judaism from within and without. And so creating this time when we come together every year to go through our fundamental origin story is something that the rabbis are extremely passionate about. And we see that in these Mishnayot. And so I'm really excited for next week. I'm really excited to continue the learning with all of you. And I hope that you'll have some more inspiration to bring to your Seder as you too, however you do so, go through again and again perhaps the most important story of our tradition. So thank you all for being with me today, and I'll see you for our final session next week.